In 1885, in the silent corridors of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, a man moves with the precision of someone who has spent his entire life on battlefields. He is not Japanese. His posture is military, his eyes are Western, and at his waist he carries something almost no foreigner has ever been allowed to carry. 2 swords, the long katana, the short wakizashi, the ultimate symbol of a samurai. The Imperial Guards treat him with deference. High-ranking officers call him sensei, master, teacher. The Emperor Meiji himself trusts this man with his personal security. This man stands at the very heart of Japanese power, with a level of access and honor that no other Westerner has ever achieved. He goes by a Japanese name. He speaks the language fluently. He knows the codes of Bushido as deeply as any warrior born in the mountains of Satsuma or the dojos of Edo. But if you pull the thread of this man's story and go back 20 years in time, you will find him in a completely different place. And that is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. You will find him in 1865 in Virginia, wearing a faded gray uniform covered in mud and gunpowder, staring at a battlefield littered with corpses. He is an American soldier. He fought for the Confederacy, and he has just lost the bloodiest war the United States has ever waged against itself. His real name is Charles William Friend. And what happened between the defeat in Virginia and the samurai swords in Japan is one of the most extraordinary stories you will ever hear. This is the story of an American who, when his own country had no place left for him, crossed the largest ocean on the planet and was reborn as something else, not as a fugitive, not as an adventurer, but as a samurai, legitimate, recognized, respected. And here is the most striking part. Friend did not do this alone. Before him, another American, a merchant from the other side of the war, unknowingly opened the door that would make it all possible. 2 men, 2 trajectories, 1 improbable destiny on the opposite end of the world. Get ready, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the American Civil War, about feudal Japan, and about the kind of life a man can build when he decides to start over from absolute zero. To understand the magnitude of what Charles William Friend accomplished, you first have to understand what it meant to be a Confederate veteran in April of 1865. And that requires looking directly at the deepest wound in American history. The Civil War lasted 4 years, 4 years that felt like an eternity to those who fought. The scale of the destruction was something the United States had never seen and, frankly, had never imagined possible. 620,000 Americans dead, Americans killing Americans, brothers against brothers. There are documented cases of families split down the middle, one son wearing blue and the other wearing gray. When Robert E. Lee surrendered his sword at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the South did not just lose a war, the South lost an entire world. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston were reduced to rubble. Railroads had been torn from the ground. Plantations lay abandoned or burned. The agrarian economy of the South, built on cotton and sustained by slave labor, simply ceased to exist overnight. And what happened to the soldiers who fought? High-ranking officers like Lee and Joseph Johnston negotiated terms of surrender and, over time, were absorbed back into civilian life with some degree of dignity. But the vast mass of privates and lower-ranking officers, men like Charles William Friend, went home and found no home at all. Friend had fought in Virginia. Virginia was the epicenter of the war. More battles were fought in that state than in any other. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. Names that are still studied in military academies today because of the sheer concentrated violence they represent. At the Battle of Cold Harbor, for example, 7,000 Union soldiers fell in less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Friend witnessed that level of horror. He survived it. But surviving that kind of thing leaves scars that no peace treaty can heal. Now, with the war over, Friend faced Reconstruction. The period when the federal government in Washington took control of the southern states, imposed military rule, and tried to remake Southern society from top to bottom. For a Confederate veteran, this meant living under occupation by the very army he had spent 4 years trying to defeat. It meant seeing former slaves hold public office, something that, for the mindset of the time, was a social earthquake difficult to process, regardless of the moral judgment we make today. Many Confederate veterans tried to rebuild their lives right where they were. Others went west to the frontier, where land was still cheap and few questions were asked about a man's past. But a small and very peculiar number of men looked at the world map and asked themselves a radical question. What if the answer is not in the United States? What if there is another place, completely different, where a man can start from scratch without the weight of defeat on his shoulders? Charles William Friend was one of those men, and the place he chose was so distant, so exotic, so completely outside anything an American could imagine, that it deserves a chapter of its own. While Friend walked through the ruins of Virginia on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, there existed a country that, for all practical purposes, was another planet. Japan in 1865 was not the Japan of anime, Toyota cars, or Tokyo skyscrapers. It was a feudal country that had spent the previous 250 years deliberately isolated from the rest of the world. The Tokugawa shogunate, a hereditary military dictatorship, ruled with an iron fist. Society was rigidly stratified. At the top, the emperor, a divine figure but politically powerless, confined to Kyoto. Below him, the shogun, who held real power from Edo, the future Tokyo. Then the daimyos, feudal lords who controlled entire provinces with their own samurai armies. And then the samurai themselves, the warrior class that lived under a code of honor called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Below the samurai came the peasants, the artisans, and at the bottom, the merchants. A person was born and died in the same social class. There was no mobility. There was no questioning. Order was maintained by the sword and by fear. And there was one absolutely inflexible rule. Foreigners were not allowed in, period. This policy of isolation, called sakoku, had been instituted in the 17th century after the shoguns concluded that European influence, especially Christian missionaries, posed a threat to the stability of the regime. Christianity was brutally suppressed. Thousands of converted Japanese were executed. Portuguese and Spanish traders were expelled. Only a small Dutch colony remained, confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Bay called Dejima. They were the only Westerners authorized to set foot on Japanese soil, and even then under constant surveillance, forbidden to leave the island, forbidden to learn Japanese, forbidden from any unauthorized contact with the local population. If a foreign ship wrecked on the Japanese coast, the crew could be summarily executed. This was not theoretical. It happened multiple times. Japan was not just closed. Japan was actively hostile to anything coming from the outside. But the outside world was not willing to accept this isolation forever. In 1853, a squadron of American warships, painted black and powered by steam, entered Edo Bay without asking permission. These were the famous Black Ships of Commodore Matthew Perry. Perry had a clear mission from the United States government: open Japan to trade, even if it had to be done through intimidation. He delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding a trade treaty and promised to return the following year for an answer. The shock in Japan was seismic. The samurai saw those iron ships belching smoke and understood in an instant of lucid terror that they were centuries behind militarily. Their swords, their lacquered armor, their wooden castles, none of it had the slightest use against modern naval cannons. The shogunate panicked. It split between those who wanted to resist at any cost and those who thought it was better to concede temporarily while arming themselves. In the end, they conceded. In 1854, Japan signed its first treaty with the United States. Within a few years, other powers, Britain, France, Russia, the Netherlands, secured similar treaties. The floodgates were open. But opening the floodgates did not mean Japan was ready for what was coming. The country plunged into a violent political crisis. Radical samurai groups began assassinating foreigners, and Japanese officials they considered collaborators. Their slogan was Sano Joy: revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. At the same time, young samurai from peripheral provinces who had been kept from power for centuries realized that the arrival of foreigners represented an opportunity. If they could master Western technologies, they could challenge the shogunate and seize power in the name of the emperor. This perfect storm exploded in 1868. The Boshin War, a Japanese civil war, toppled the Tokugawa shogunate and placed the young Emperor Meiji at the center of political power for the first time in 700 years. The Meiji Restoration, as it became known, was not just a change of government, it was a complete revolution. Japan decided that, rather than being colonized by Westerners, it was going to become strong enough to compete with them on equal terms. And to do that, it needed everything: railroads, telegraphs, factories, a steam-powered navy, a modern army trained in the European style. And this is exactly where the story of Charles William Friend connects with the story of Japan, through a man who arrived before him, an American no one remembers, but who unwittingly built the bridge that Friend would cross. Eugene Van Reed was from Pennsylvania. He fought for the Union during the Civil War. He survived, but like so many veterans, he found that civilian life was a strange and unsatisfying territory. He was a man of ambition, of restlessness, the kind of person who cannot stand still. While Friend brooded over defeat in the South, Van Reed brooded over the emptiness of victory in the North. In 1865, Van Reed made a decision that most Americans would have considered madness. He boarded a ship bound for Japan. He arrived in Yokohama, a small fishing village that the unequal treaties had hastily transformed into an international port. It was a strange place, a contact zone between two worlds that did not understand each other. On one side, Western merchants eager for silk, tea, and lucrative contracts. On the other, the Japanese, torn between ancestral suspicion and the urgent need to learn. Van Reed set up an import and export business, but he was more than a merchant. He had a vision. He believed that the future belonged to whoever could translate the West to the East and the East to the West. And it was this belief that led him to do something that, at the time, was absolutely forbidden by Japanese law. In 1868, the same year the Boshin War was toppling the shogunate, Van Reed secretly organized the sending of a group of young Japanese men to the United States. This was not an official exchange. The Japanese government did not authorize it. It was a clandestine operation. Van Reed convinced merchants and low-ranking samurai that their sons would have a better future if they studied in the country that had just emerged victorious from an industrial civil war. These young men ended up in California. They worked on farms, learned English, absorbed American culture. One of them, Tateshi Onojiru, became known as Tommy and turned into a minor local celebrity, a Japanese boy in a kimono trying to be a cowboy, with results that were sometimes comical, sometimes moving. Most of these young men eventually returned to Japan, and when they returned, they were transformed. They spoke English. They understood how an industrial economy worked. They knew that Japan's future depended on absorbing Western knowledge without losing its own identity. Many of them became important officials in the new Meiji government, working as interpreters, translators, and advisors. Van Reed, ironically, did not reap the fruits of what he planted. In 1868, he became involved in an international scandal when he attempted to send Japanese laborers to sugarcane plantations in Hawaii, something Japanese authorities considered human trafficking. He was arrested, prosecuted, and came dangerously close to being executed. The intervention of the American consulate saved his life, but his reputation never fully recovered. He died years later, forgotten, a footnote in the history of Japan-United States relations. But the door he opened, that door no one could close. The idea that Americans and Japanese could collaborate, could learn from each other, had been planted. And when the Meiji government began actively hiring foreign specialists to modernize the country, there was a precedent. There was a path. Charles William Friend, on the other side of the Pacific, knew none of this yet, but he was about to find out. Reconstructing the exact step-by-step journey of Charles William Friend from Virginia to Japan is an exercise in historical archaeology. The records are fragmented, but the general outlines are clear enough for us to assemble the picture. At some point between 1868 and 1871, Friend left the United States. He probably passed through San Francisco, which at the time was the main port of departure for anyone venturing into the Pacific. From there, merchant ships took weeks to cross the ocean, making stops in Hawaii or other intermediate ports. What drives a man to do this? This was not a tourist trip. 19th century ships in the Pacific were uncomfortable, dangerous, and unpredictable. Storms, diseases, scurvy, mutinies, everything was on the menu. Friend was not rich. He was not fleeing justice, as far as anyone knows. He was simply a man who looked at his life in America and decided there was no future there. He preferred the absolute unknown over continuing to live as a relic of a lost cause. When Friend disembarked in Japan, the country was in a frenzy of modernization. The Meiji government was hiring hundreds of foreign specialists, the so-called Oyatoi Gaikokujin, hired foreign employees. There were British engineers building railroads, German doctors organizing hospitals, French naval officers training sailors, American agronomists teaching farming techniques. Japan was assembling its national army based on the Prussian model and needed instructors who knew how to fight the modern way. Friend presented himself as exactly that, a real combat veteran with experience in artillery, cavalry, and infantry. He had something that many theoretical instructors lacked. He had been there. He had seen modern warfare up close. He knew what a bayonet charge under cannon fire felt like, what it meant to dig a trench while bullets whizzed over your head, what it was like to watch your comrades die beside you and keep fighting. The Japanese recognized this value immediately. Friend was hired. Imagine the scene. A military training ground on the outskirts of Tokyo, early 1870s. Japanese recruits, most of them from peasant backgrounds, something revolutionary, because in feudal Japan, a peasant could not be a soldier. That was the exclusive privilege of the samurai. Now, for the first time, the Meiji government was forming a conscript army, a people's army, based on the Western model. And standing in front of these recruits, shouting commands with a heavy accent, is a middle-aged American with battle scars on his arms and a look in his eyes that has seen things those young men could not even imagine. Friend taught artillery. He taught combat formations. He taught fire discipline, the cadence of coordinated shooting that made the difference between an efficient unit and an armed mob. He taught how to dig defensive trenches, how to position cannons on high ground, how to calculate the trajectory of a shell. Everything he had learned on the bloody fields of Virginia, he was now transferring to soldiers who would one day fight in the wars that would turn Japan into an imperial power. But Friend did something that most foreign instructors did not do. He did not remain isolated in a Western bubble. He learned Japanese, and not the superficial Japanese of merchants, but the deep language with its layers of formality and hierarchy. He studied the customs. He learned the etiquette, how to bow, how to address a superior, how to conduct himself in a tea ceremony. He respected the codes of honor that governed the lives of Japanese warriors. For the Japanese, this was almost shocking. They were accustomed to arrogant foreigners who treated Japan as a backward country and its culture as a quaint curiosity. Friend was different. He demonstrated genuine humility. He recognized that he was there to learn as much as to teach. This posture opened doors that no employment contract could open. Friend began to be invited to exclusive social circles. High-ranking officers sought him out for private conversations. He became more than an employee. He became a trusted advisor, someone whose opinion was valued not only in technical matters, but in broader strategic questions. The years passed. Friend grew old in Japan, and at some point, historians debate the exact date, but evidence points to the early 1880s. Something happened that had no precedent. The Japanese government granted Charles William Friend the right to wear the two swords. To understand the magnitude of this gesture, you have to understand what the two swords meant in Japan. The long katana and the short wakizashi formed the daisho, literally large and small. It was the symbol of the samurai class. More than weapons, they were the soul of the warrior. A samurai carried his swords as an extension of his body and his spirit. They represented his honor, his status, his place in the universe. During the Tokugawa shogunate, only samurai had the right to wear the two swords. A peasant or merchant caught with a katana could be executed on the spot. The daisho was the visible boundary between the warrior elite and the rest of society. In the 1870s, the Meiji government officially abolished the samurai class. The public wearing of swords was banned. It was an unpopular measure that provoked armed revolts. such as the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, where thousands of samurai died facing the new conscript army with machine guns. Exactly the kind of army that men like Friend had helped train. But even with the general prohibition, the government made exceptions. Certain individuals could receive special authorization to wear the swords. These were people whose honor and service were considered so exceptional that they deserved the highest recognition Japan could offer. Charles William Friend received this authorization, an American, a veteran of a lost war on the other side of the world. Think about what this means. Japan was a country that just 15 years earlier had executed foreigners who set foot on its shores, a country that viewed the outside world as an existential threat, a source of contamination. And now that same country was granting a foreigner the most sacred of samurai symbols, not as an empty diplomatic gesture, not as a decoration to hang on a wall, but as a real recognition that this man had earned by his own merit the right to be treated as an elite warrior. Friend wore his swords with pride. He became a naturalized Japanese citizen. He adopted a Japanese name. He married a Japanese woman and built a family. His children were educated in the values of Bushido, loyalty, courage, rectitude, honor, blended with their father's American heritage. He became a bodyguard and close advisor to Emperor Meiji. The man who had witnessed defeat in Virginia now walked the corridors of power in the country, destined to become the greatest power in Asia. He was respected, he was feared, he was listened to, and he wore the two swords with the ease of someone who had finally found his place in the world. There is an additional layer to this story that is pure historical speculation, but solid speculation grounded in chronology and probability. Eugene Van Reed, the Yankee merchant who opened the door for Japanese to study in the United States, continued living in Japan during the same years that Friend was rising through military circles. Both were in Yokohama and Tokyo during the same period. Both were Americans, one from the north, one from the south, in a country where foreigners formed a small, interconnected community. It is almost impossible that they did not meet. And if they did meet, the encounter must have been fascinating. Two Americans who fought on opposite sides, now living in the same foreign country, working for the same government, each in his own way helping to build the new Japan. Van Reed, the man who unwittingly paved the way. Friend, the man who walked that way to the very end. And there is also Tommy, Takeshi Onojiru, the young Japanese man Van Reed sent to America, who returned transformed. Tommy worked as an interpreter and official for the Meiji government. He frequented the same environments as Friend. It is perfectly plausible, perhaps even probable, that they met. Tommy, who learned to be an American in California. Friend, who learned to be Japanese in Tokyo. Two mirrors, each reflecting the other. Official history does not record these meetings, but the best stories are often found between the lines of official records, in the silences that documents leave behind. And the silence here is eloquent. Charles William Friend lived the rest of his days in Japan. He did not return to the United States. There is no record that he felt homesick, or that he ever considered going back to the country where he was born. Japan was his home. He had earned that. When Friend died, already at the beginning of the 20th century, he was buried in Japanese soil. His grave displays no American flags. There are no references to the Confederacy, to the Civil War, to the battles of Virginia. The headstone is inscribed in Japanese, Because Charles William Friend, at the end of his journey, was no longer an American living in Japan. He was Japanese. His family continued in the country. His descendants integrated completely into Japanese society. The blood of an American soldier from the Civil War runs through the veins of Japanese citizens to this day. A genetic and historical detail so extraordinary, it seems like fiction, but it is not. The story of Charles William Friend forces us to rethink many things. First, it forces us to rethink the American Civil War. We are used to seeing that conflict as the definitive watershed, the event that defined who was American and who was not. But for Friend, the war was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a completely different one. The defeat that seemed to have destroyed his future was, in reality, the push that led him to find a destiny more extraordinary than any victory could have given him. Second, it forces us to rethink what it means to belong to a place. Friend was born American. He fought as an American. But it was in Japan, a country that was not his, a culture that was not his, a language he had to learn from scratch, that he found the recognition, the respect, and the purpose that his homeland did not offer him. This calls into question the idea that we belong to the place where we were born. Perhaps we belong to the place that accepts us, to the place where we can become who we really are. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that the history we know is full of holes. Charles William Friend should be a known name. His trajectory should be in school textbooks, in documentaries, in films. But it is not. It has remained hidden in the margins, buried in dusty archives, mentioned briefly in academic studies that no one reads. For every Friend that history has forgotten, how many others are there? How many extraordinary lives are waiting in silence to be rediscovered? A defeated American soldier, an entire ocean to cross, an unknown country on the other side of the world, and, in the end, 2 swords at his waist, worn with the honor that no battlefield in Virginia could ever give him. This is the story of Charles William Friend, a man who lost everything and, in losing everything, discovered that he could be anything, including a samurai. History is full of stories that deserve to be told, the forgotten ones, the strange ones, the ones that make you stop and realize that the truth is often more extraordinary than anything we could make up. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Drop a comment below. I read them all, and I'd love to know what you think. There are a lot more stories waiting in the margins. Let's find them together. See you in the next one.